Hi, I'm Nick Weatherton, co-founder of GradVantageRX. Through our years of helping pharmacy students match into the residencies of their choice, we've found that certain interview techniques are vital to being successful through this process and are also much easier to demonstrate than they are to explain. The purpose of this video is to provide an overview of the interview process, focusing on the interviewer's perspective, which is an important perspective to take even when you're the interviewee. We also want to demonstrate techniques for answering common and tricky residency interview questions. These techniques are broadly applicable and can be used for any set of interview questions. Because we were focusing on the technique, I want to be clear that the answers that I gave in this video are not my own, because the answers are much less important than the way that they're delivered and how they're tied together to maximize your rapport and effect on the interviewer. I shouldn't have to tell you this, but I was dressed way too casually to be an interviewee, but you know how to dress, and that's not what this video is about. So let's talk a little bit about some general interview points. We have to acknowledge that interviews in general are a very imperfect tool. You can't get a full glimpse of someone in an hour. However, they're what we use, and so we have to know how to play within their bounds. They're actually kind of a strange tool too. Consider this example. If a residency interviewer asks you why you want to do their program, and you, from rote memorization, talk for 10 minutes about all the merits of their program, that's weird. Contrasting that, if a residency interviewer asks you why you want to be a resident at their program and you haven't thought about it, and you say, I don't know, that's weird. So there is the right amount of rehearsed, and there's some performative aspect to a residency interview. You need to keep in mind that adjusting your answers or your delivery to the audience is not being dishonest. It's helping to maximize your chances and impact during that interview. There's a couple of unspoken rules when we're thinking about any interview. I've been in enough residency interview committees to know that someone having a good feeling about a student or candidate is almost always more powerful than that student or candidate having a strong CV. Your CV is to get you in the door, but your residency performance is to make sure that you get to match there. If you think about how often students who've had a rotation at a facility end up matching a residency, it's a lot more frequent than unknown students matching at that same residency. That's because of one of the most important concepts of residency interviewing, which is consistency. If you have a rotation at a facility, they know you're going to show up on time every day because they've seen you do it over and over again. They know you're going to be a hard worker because they've seen you do it over and over again. Emphasizing your positive qualities is one of the most important strategies that you can use to have a good interview experience, and continuing to be consistent in emphasizing those is going to minimize what we call cognitive dissonance. This is an interesting psychological topic that essentially involves someone feeling discomfort when the story that they're being told doesn't seem to match up. In the case of an interview, if you are emphasizing that you're a homebody and that you only like to stay home and study, and then later in the interview, you say that the way you handle stress is to go out and shake your booty on a Saturday night, you are giving a bit of an inconsistent story. Those small, seemingly minor inconsistencies can add up to an interviewer feeling like you weren't being totally honest with them. And so consistently emphasizing your best qualities is a very powerful tool to ensuring success on interview day. As you think through your interview strategy, one of the questions you can almost be guaranteed that you will be asked is to just tell the interviewers about yourself. This is often seen as an icebreaker question, but strategically, it's one of the most important questions that you need to answer. You should be emphasizing positive qualities, talking about how those are deeply ingrained in you, and then tying back your answers to some of those positive qualities throughout the interview. Because this is such an important part of your strategy, you should have several origin stories of things that you really believe about yourself. You should be able to talk about why you're a hard worker. Maybe you saw your parents work really hard when you were a kid. You should be able to talk about what drew you into pharmacy and how that drives your passion. These things will be told in a compelling way during your answer to that question of tell us about yourself, and you can tie back to them throughout the interview as a means of repeating and reinforcing the interviewer's beliefs about your good qualities. You should also be prepared to personalize your answer of tell us about you to the program in the same way that you would personalize a letter of intent. This isn't being dishonest, it's simply emphasizing the qualities that you feel make you the best possible match for the program. So now that we've talked about some general interview strategies to keep your story cohesive and compelling, let's talk a little bit about the type of people that are going to be interviewing you. And we're talking specifically here about residency program directors and the residency interview committee. At every facility that I've ever been at, That is an unpaid position that involves the person in untold meetings and untold amounts of paperwork. And so a person has to be really passionate about clinical pharmacy and kind of an overachiever to take that job. You should know that about them as you speak to them. This person really wants to further the field of pharmacy, and this person is passionate about teaching. If you can show yourself to be a good learner and another person who's passionate about the field of pharmacy, you're setting yourself up for success in the interview process. So knowing what the RPD's priorities are is also an important part of this process. If you think, what would the residency program director say is the ideal residency candidate? Well, it's probably someone who matches with their personality trait of wanting to further the field. Maybe their ideal resident is going to perform groundbreaking research at their institution and get the RPD noticed on the national stage, or at least by their boss. This resident will be a fantastic coworker, will do everything told of them and more, will never complain or make extra headaches for the RPD. However, almost nobody gets that shining star of a resident. Of course, I mean, other than my residency program director. What residency program directors are really trying to avoid are residents that are going to be problematic. These people may be problematic because they don't have adequate clinical knowledge to do the job. They could be problems because they lack interpersonal skills and end up riling up patients or isolating their coworkers. Or they could be problematic because they just don't receive constructive feedback well. These people can be a real headache for RPDs, and you want to make sure that they know that you're not going to be one of them. It's also important to acknowledge that a residency interview is not exactly like a job interview in terms of what they're looking for. If we think about the distinction between what someone would want in a coworker versus what someone would want in a resident, they're slightly different. If you think about what makes a great coworker, it's someone who takes responsibility and initiative, someone who's a great communicator, and someone who's extremely competent at their job. Someone who's awesome at their job is an awesome coworker. If you were awesome at the job of clinical pharmacy, you wouldn't need to be a resident. So it's important that you imply a slightly different set of characteristics and attitudes as a pharmacy resident. So the characteristics that are desirable in a potential resident are knowing your limits. I can't say that enough. You will be wearing a white coat, you will be a pharmacist, and you will get asked pharmacist questions. You need to know when you don't know. That is very important to display in a residency interview, that you have the right amount of confidence. I know how to look things up, but I always run things by my supervisor before I do anything that is potentially of consequence. One big component of being a great resident is being a good communicator. Again, opening the lines of communication, always talking about when you don't know, but also being willing and able to receive constructive feedback well. You are going to get corrected, you are going to make mistakes, and if you get upset about it every time it happens, it's going to be a very difficult year for you and the residency program director. So displaying that you know that you need to be corrected during your interview process lets the RPD and the committee know that you have appropriate expectations of the program. Unlike someone who's working in a salaried job who is expected to do their job well and then go home, you as a resident are expected to do your job increasingly well throughout the year, but also seek out additional responsibilities, showing your willingness and ability to handle the workload, and also additional workload is a very desirable quality in a resident. So in summary, what qualities can you foster in yourself and display in an interview that make you look like a great candidate for a residency? Well, you want to display balanced confidence. For things that you've done over and over that you have a sense of, you should feel confident in talking about those things. But you also need to have an appropriate sense of caution. For new things or for decisions that have consequential outcomes, you should display a willingness to always double check. That's your job as a resident. A great attitude for a resident to have approaching residency year is showing an adequate understanding that it will be a difficult year with a very high workload and embracing that, knowing that it's going to be difficult, having proven strategies to handle the stress that's associated with being chronically overloaded, and feeling okay about that because of a deeper purpose that involves helping patients or furthering the practice of pharmacy. So with those points in mind, let's see candidate Nick apply for an ambulatory care residency in the Midwest, employing the strategies that we've just discussed.
So Nick, tell me about yourself.
Yeah, so I grew up in Florida, in a rural part of southern Florida, and I actually grew up tinkering with old clocks. It was something that my grandfather was into and got me into. We'd take them apart and put them back together and get them working better. And also really liked reading as a kid, mystery novels mostly. But as I got older, around middle school age, the kids made it really abundantly clear that that just wasn't cool. So I decided to play baseball instead. And that's what I did all through high school and really did enjoy that. When it was time to go away to pharmacy school, I decided to go to Georgia. And I really enjoyed my time there. There wasn't an organized baseball program, but I played a lot of intramural sports. Really enjoyed that as a counterbalance to studying and getting out and moving my body a little bit. And sometimes when I got lucky, I'd find a clock at Goodwill or something and be able to tinker with it a little bit as well.
What drew you to our residency program?
Yeah, so starting pharmacy school, I wasn't even sure that I wanted to do a residency. I didn't know a lot about clinical pharmacy, as I'm sure is pretty common. But as I got through my IPI and my API rotations, I found that sort of trying to translate these guidelines into specific patients was really gratifying. And being able to talk to patients and hear how these good decisions were improving their experience was awesome. And so I want to be able to do that in the future. I want to work particularly in ambulatory care. And I know that you guys have a PGY2 in AM care, which definitely drew my attention, possibly because I'm hoping to spend 2 years here, but also because I think it really indicates a very high level of commitment from your preceptors and a high level of skill. And so in addition to those things, just seeing that Dr. Jones does a lot of outcomes research on diabetes is really interesting to me because I think that that's an important step after we take care of the patients, is to do good research and show how much we're improving outcomes to advance the practice as a whole.
Tell me about a time when you were overloaded or struggling.
So my internal med rotation had a preceptor named Dr. Smith who really asked a lot of us. There was a very high patient volume. We were expected to work up every patient on the floor every day, even though our team was only covering half the patients. We made a lot of interventions, and I learned a ton from that rotation, but my gosh, was it hard. So what was great about Dr. Smith is he sort of slowly gave me more and more responsibility as he saw that I was capable of it. But what I learned throughout that rotation was that I needed to be able to triage things and take care of them in their order of importance. I would do my daily workups as early as I could so that I could take any things that popped up, which they always did. And so being able to triage, being able to have good open communication with Dr. Smith when I didn't think I could handle the workload, and being able to keep patient safety and quality of care in mind were really big to me. It also didn't hurt that there was an on-site gym there, and so I could take my lunch break and go shoot hoops and decompress a little bit.
Tell me about a time when you had a conflict with a coworker or preceptor.
Sure. So actually during my internal med rotation, that very busy rotation, we had a patient on the floor who was kind of a frequent flyer for COPD. He'd come in, get tuned up with steroids, get sent home with antibiotics, and subsequently have to come in pretty frequently for INR draws because the quinolones kept messing with his INR. So I had brought the idea to my preceptor of potentially switching him from warfarin to a DOAC for his AFib, and the preceptor, to my surprise, didn't really seem on board with the idea. He wasn't sure that the patient would be able to pay for the medicine. He wasn't quite sure that it was the right therapeutic choice, even though I had made sure that there were no contraindications. So I let it be because it was the preceptor's call ultimately. And he seemed pretty swamped that week. He was covering for both teams on the floor. There were just a lot of moving pieces. But daily I would go in and talk to the patient and we would adjust his warfarin dose as needed. And using some of my sleuthing skills from my mystery novel reading days, I kind of elucidated from him that he was having some trouble getting in for INR draws. He was having to have his son take off work to drive him in, and that was actually a big deal, but the patient didn't want to complain about it because he was a tough old veteran, as many of them are. But with that new information, I felt really a renewed sense that switching to a DOAC would be better for the patient. And so I brought that back to my preceptor. I really brushed up on my DOAC new patient education stuff. I demonstrated that for my preceptor and offered to do the training for this patient. And much to my happiness, my preceptor accepted that. We got the patient switched, and I think he's a lot better off for it.
What will you do if you don't match this year?
Yeah, that's a question I've been thinking a lot about, as I'm sure a lot of my colleagues and fellow students are. Financial security is really important for my family and I, so I have to work. And I do have a retail job in my back pocket as a backup plan. And I will work that job if I don't match. However, my desire remains to stay in the clinical world. And so even if I don't match, I need to keep my skills sharp so that I can reapply next year. I've thought about trying to moonlight either in a long-term care facility or even a hospital inpatient pharmacy, which I feel is a little bit more clinical oriented. However, those jobs are really difficult to get without a residency. And so I've often thought about potentially just writing up journal clubs as sort of a blog to keep my skills sharp and keep me sort of on the forefront of medicine until I can reapply next year.
How do you handle stress?
I've had a considerable bit of that in pharmacy school, and so I've had some practice. One thing that I really like to do, as I've alluded to, is if I have a clock that I'm working on, diving into the very small pieces of that helps me to kind of just dive into the mechanics of it and helps me to think through the smaller aspects of whatever problem I might be mulling over that's stressing me out. Additionally, I really find that moving my body and sweating is a great counterbalance to the kind of brain work that we do. And so I've noticed that the communities around here actually have intramural squash. I've never played squash, but I think this is potentially a good opportunity to learn. And so I'd really like to check that out if I do end up here.
What can you offer our program that others cannot?
Sure. So being from a small town, I feel like has given me an opportunity to really value relationships and be somewhat forced to talk with people of differing backgrounds or sort of different viewpoints than me. And so I feel very comfortable talking to people who aren't necessarily like me or who don't necessarily agree with me, but in a way that makes us both feel good about the conversation. Additionally, I think I've worked really hard through pharmacy school to sharpen my clinical skills. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's done that, but I do have a real drive to work in ambulatory care. I really love working with these patients. I want to make their lives better. And then I want to do the research that shows that and furthers the practice of pharmacy as a whole.
Tell me about a time when you did pharmacy-related work that you did not find valuable.
Sure. So during my community rotation, this pharmacy was very focused on servicing long-term care facilities, which meant individually pre-packing tablets for all the residents. Very important for safety, very important to get right, but mind-numbing. And so what I would do to try to keep engaged is just like quiz myself on brand generics as I saw these medications coming through. Additionally, I tried to engage with the pharmacist and talk about common problems that the long-term care residents had and kind of the systems that were in place to help them with that. So although I wouldn't wish pre-packing on anyone, I ended up learning quite a bit from that rotation, which I didn't expect to.
Teach me something.
Okay. All right, I've got it. Do you know what makes a rapid in a river? So the acronym COVE can help you to remember that. So constriction is the sea, the river gets narrower. Obstruction, like a big rock, will make the water flow faster around it. Volume, higher water level, moving the same distance has to go faster. Or elevation, like a waterfall. And now you know that when you see a rapid, COVE is what's causing it.
If you had to critique your own performance as a P4 student, what would you improve?
There's quite a few. How much time have you got? I'll focus on two, I think. I don't feel that I'm assertive enough when I'm making recommendations, particularly with attendings or pharmacists that I don't have a great deal of personal rapport with. I can sometimes feel a bit timid with that. And I think what's really related to that is no matter how much work I go through to be sure about a recommendation I'm making, I never feel fully sure. I'm never 100% certain. And I'm hoping that putting myself into more complicated clinical situations, getting more reps to practice that, and just continuing to get out of my comfort zone and make those recommendations will help me to improve on those things. But that's definitely something I need to work on.
Give me an example of a recommendation you've recently made. What was your process for making sure your recommendation was correct?
Yeah, so actually what I was thinking of as I answered the last question to you was vancomycin dosing for this patient who came in with complicated osteomyelitis. We did the calculations. I rechecked my calculations online. I came up with roughly the same answers, and I felt really good about making the recommendation, but still I just wanted to be sure. And so what I did in this case was I actually reached out to a fellow student and who's currently on an infectious disease rotation and just asked if this dose sounded like it was within the realm of possibility. And so they sort of confirmed that. And so I would say that my process is definitely to look into things as much as I can using well-validated resources to make sure that I'm making the best possible recommendations, and then running them by someone before I actually make them, which helps me to feel more sure. And I'm hoping to use the preceptors here for that in the year going forward. One final topic that we want to discuss with our clients is the questions that you should be asking an interviewer. By and large, the questions that you should be asking are not readily available anywhere else. They should show the depth of your research and show the depth of your commitment to the program. Asking about early commitment processes where appropriate is a really good question that displays interest. Asking about research opportunities and extra opportunities and elective opportunities are all ways to show that you've done the basic amount of research and that you're very interested in the program. Finally, I've found that it never hurts to ask a silly question at the end. This can be something based on the geography of the place, like whether they like the Cubs or the White Sox, whether they go to Pat's or Geno's for cheesesteaks in Philadelphia. Anything that shows that you've also done some research in the city, displays interest, and leaves the interview with a nice, lighthearted tone. Thanks for your attention, and thanks for choosing GradVantageRX to guide you through this process.
So Nick, tell me about yourself.
Oh, you know, it's like weightlifting and kittens or whatever. Tell me about yourself.
Tell me about what you see as your greatest weakness.
Why? What did Dr. Johnson tell you about me? That guy's such a talk. I can't believe he said this.
Tell me what you think is your greatest strength.
Definitely World of Warcraft. I'm a level 12 warlock. I've got all the dungeons mastered. I've captured all the dragons. I'm really good at Dungeons and Dragons. I also know a lot about wizards. Not as much about warlocks, but still a lot. So much about warlocks and gnomes. I really like gnomes. I'm also really handsome. And finally, I think that it's important to note that I really like anime. I really like anime.
What will you do if you don't match this year?
Well, that's obviously not going to happen. Look at me.
Tell me how you handle stress.
So I like to make little figurines of the people who have wronged me. And I sometimes stick pins in their eyes or their ears, and I just sit back and see what happens.
What can you offer our program that other candidates cannot?
Can you try not to breathe towards me?